I'll be reading Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. In your P Bible, it will be on page 1120. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You may be seated.
Good morning, church.
Good morning.
I wanted to make an announcement regarding the fact that we have added some new listening assisted devices. We have a few that are available for your use. And so that means some of you in here may be listening to me for the very first time. So I need to really make sure I'm on it today. But I'm happy about that. You know, it's always good that we can reach out to those who need to hear God's word, however we can. And so I'm glad we're doing that. I also quickly, just a reminder, tonight is our first youth night, and I'm really excited about it. And youth of all ages are welcome. If you want to just come and be a part and see what's going on, if you want to help out a little bit setting up, I would love to have you there. And so that'll be really, really exciting. But I'm also very excited today to continue the Easter story that we have been studying together for the last few weeks, because it's important that we know the story of Easter as Christians. The Easter story is our number one story. It's the story of our redemption, of the redemption of the entire world, past, present, and future. And so it's important that we know this story, that we're familiar with it, that we're able to testify to it for all those who need to know this story. Because Easter it's about more than chocolate bunnies and Easter eggs, as much as I love them. And yes, we are having an Easter egg hunt, and that's a good thing. It's a good way for us to engage people, but it's only a starting point. It's only a point of entry, and it's good that we understand the Easter story. And today, let me reread this passage, because I think this is so powerful. The passage that Samuel read for us out of Romans. It says, "You see, at just the right time, when we were powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, but for a good person, someone might possibly die. But God demonstrates his love for us this way, that while we were still sinners, when we were not righteous or good, Christ died for us." That is the story of Easter. That is a powerful, powerful message of redemption that we need. And so today, we're going to be looking at the trial of Jesus. Though it wasn't really a trial, not a real one, not a legal one. But we're going to be reading about the trials of Jesus. And I want us to pay attention to three characters in this story. The first character is going to be the Sanhedrin. The second character is going to be the governor. And the last character is going to be the prisoner. So I want you to pay attention to these, and we'll talk about their importance at the end here. But we begin where we left off last week in Matthew 26. In verse 57, it says, "Those who had seized Jesus, who had arrested him and captured him, they led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders had gathered." And this is the gathering of the Sanhedrin. And quickly, that's a word that many people are not familiar with. So I want to explain to you what the Sanhedrin is so that we're understanding what's happening here. So in the Jewish community, in Jewish society, there were judges, there were groups of elders who had been appointed to see over disputes and see over legal proceedings and to issue judgments. And in all of the Jewish cities and all of the lands, there were these judges, these groups. But the greatest of these groups was in Jerusalem, and it was the Sanhedrin. The smaller groups had like 20-something, but the Sanhedrin was made up of over 70 elders, 70 men who had spent their lives studying Jewish law, and whose entire lives were dedicated to enacting Jewish law and giving judgments for the Jewish people. They are the highest authority in Jewish society, the Sanhedrin, over 70 judges. And so the people who seized Jesus led them to the high priest, Caiaphas, where the scribes and the elders of the Sanhedrin were gathered. And it says, and Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now, this is important for us because if you remember from last week, what happened to all of the disciples when Jesus was arrested was that they fled. They ran for their lives because it was in that moment that they realized that not only was Jesus' life in danger, but their own lives were in danger. When they saw the soldiers coming, armed with swords, armed with weapons and armor, they were used to confronting the teachers of the law. They were used to confronting religious authorities, but they weren't used to confronting Roman soldiers. And so when they saw a legion of Roman soldiers coming to arrest Jesus, they ran and they fled for their lives. But Peter is still with Jesus in this moment. And this is the same Peter that Jesus said, you will deny me 3 times. And he said, I will follow you until the end. And so he is here with Jesus in spite of everything that's happened because he wants to see what is going to happen. And maybe he's still holding out hope that Jesus isn't going to die, that he can be saved from this. But whatever the case, he's here to see it, to see the end, as they put it in Matthew. So Peter is here to watch this trial. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. So many people were giving false witness about Jesus, but they could not find any actual thing to put Jesus to death. And so they have these false witnesses come forward. It says, at last 2 came forward and said, this man said, Jesus said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. They're referencing something Jesus had talked about earlier. And the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Tell us if you are the Messiah. And Jesus said to him, you have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tears his robes, he tears off his clothes in anger and says, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy from his own mouth. What is your judgment?" And so he asks all the other elders and scribes who are part of the Sanhedrin, "What is your judgment?" And they answered, "He deserves death." And then they spit on his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" Now, there are two things about this trial that I want us to notice. Two things. First, I want us to notice the injustices of this trial, the farce that this trial really is, because there are many things happening here that actually go against Jewish law. And I'm not a Jewish law buff, but I have done some research, and I've been introduced to it a little bit, enough to know that what they are doing to Jesus here is wrong. Some of the things that they do here that are not allowed in their own law is the fact that they arrested Jesus in the middle of the night, and they immediately took him before the Sanhedrin. There was no time in between. There was no notice ahead of time, and that is illegal according to Jewish law. There should be time to prepare a case. There should be time to prepare for a just trial. But they weren't interested in a just trial. And so they immediately take Jesus before the Sanhedrin. Another thing about it, the high priest Caiaphas is prosecuting Jesus. He is the judge, but he is also prosecuting Jesus, and that was not allowed under Jewish law. They also accepted false testimony of individuals that they knew was false, and yet they accepted it because without it, they could not find a way to judge Jesus guilty. And the last is that they gave him an unjust punishment. They said that he deserves death. But they knew better than anyone else, as experts in the law, that under Jewish law, that he did not deserve death. And yet, they doled out this judgment that he deserves death. And so, this trial is unjust. And yet, what amazes me about this, and what you may have noticed too, is that throughout the entire thing, it says Jesus remained silent. Jesus remained silent. And it's amazing. It's amazing because think about all the times before this when Jesus has been confronted by teachers of the law, by scribes, by Pharisees. How many times has Jesus opened his mouth to put the doubters in their place? How many times has he had to set the record straight? And he's done it every single time. But in this moment, he is silent. He doesn't even admit to being the Messiah, the Son of God. He simply says, "You have said so." He wouldn't say, "Yes, I am." He simply said, "You have said so." But he does say one thing. He says this, "I tell you, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." This is important to note, and I want to come back to this at the end. But the only thing that Jesus says through this whole thing is he speaks to the coming glory. He speaks to the coming redemption that will be coming about. That's the only thing he says. But other than that, he remains completely silent. And so after this trial, they take Jesus before the governor, the Roman governor of the area of Jerusalem, Pilate, in chapter 27. So we're going to skip down to Matthew 27, verse 11. Now, some things happen, some side stories happen in between this trial and the next, but it's too much for us to get into here and now. But there are a few other things that happened that are worth studying and worth looking at. But we're going to look at this second trial of Jesus, this time not before Jewish authorities, but before the Roman authority, which is the governor, Pilate. And so it says, verse 11, "Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' And Jesus said again, 'You have said so. You have said so.' But when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer." So again, they're here accusing him, and he says nothing. And then Pilate said to Jesus, "Do you not hear how many things that they testify against you? Don't you hear the things that they're saying about you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. And again, we see Jesus here is silent. And Pilate notices this, and he is amazed. And now we're going to take a look at this last character, the prisoner. It says, "Now the feast of the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas." I said that wrong. Barabbas. Thank you. I knew that was wrong when it came out of my mouth. Barabbas. Thank you. So they have this notorious prisoner, Barabbas. He is notorious. That means he is well known because of the crimes he has committed. Everyone knows who this man is because of his crimes. It says, "So when they gathered, Pilate said to them, 'Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?' In verse 18, "For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up." So Pilate knows what the Jewish authorities are doing. He knows that Jesus is not guilty. He knows that Jesus is only there because they are envious of Jesus. And so he comes up with a plan. He says, "We're going to release a prisoner. So who would you rather have? Would you rather have me release Jesus, or would you rather have me release Barabbas, the prisoner, who is the worst of the worst, who is so terrible and evil that he is notorious throughout the land for the things that he has done? Surely the people will say, 'Release Jesus. Do not let Barabbas back into society.'" It says, besides the fact that Pilate knew what they were up to, while Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent a message to him, sent a word to him. And she said this, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." And so Pilate was very aware of what was happening. In verse 20, it says, "Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus." So the governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release?" And they said, "Barabbas. Give us Barabbas." And Pilate said to them, "What shall I say? What shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they said, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." And there's a reason the authorities brought Jesus before Pilate. There's a couple reasons. First is because they were seeking the death sentence. And under their Jewish laws, they could not find a way to kill Jesus. They tried again and again, but they knew Jesus knew the law better than them, and they could not trap him. So they put him before Pilate. seeking the death penalty. And the other part is this: Pilate was the governor of Rome, and he had duties to Rome to keep the peace. And so what they did was they started to incite a riot among the people, yelling and screaming, "Give us Barabbas, crucify Jesus, crucify him." The worst possible punishment that could be done to him. Crucify Jesus. And they incite this crowd, screaming and angry and yelling and spitting, to crucify Jesus. And then what I'm about to show you is, in my opinion, the coolest thing in the entire Bible. So let's read. So, when Pilate saw the crowd, he saw that there was no convincing them, that he was gaining nothing by trying to convince them that Jesus is innocent, but rather that a riot was beginning, that the people were stirred up, that they were angry. And he saw this happening. He saw their anger. He saw the evil in the crowd. And so he took water and he washed his hands before the crowd, and he told them, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And then all the people answered Pilate, "His blood be on us and on our children." And this is, in my opinion, the most powerful verse in the entire Bible. Because when I read those words, I can hear the voices of the people in that crowd yelling and screaming and hot with anger. "His blood be on us and our children." And their intentions were evil, and their intentions were selfish, and they were wrong, but they didn't even understand what they were saying. Let the blood of Jesus be on us and be on our children. You see, God was taking something meant for pure evil, and he was using it to save them, and they didn't even know it. And that's something that only our God can do. And that's why, to me, this is the coolest, most awesome verse in all of the Bible. It says, "And then he released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus," that means having whipped Jesus, "they delivered him to be crucified." They delivered him to be crucified. And these are the two trials of Jesus. I want us to take a look at those three characters in this story. The first was the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin, for me, they represent those who are too proud. They represent those who are too mighty and too high to humble themselves the way that Jesus humbled himself. You see, the men who sat in the seats, those judgment seats, they were supported by money and wealth and power and status. And it was because of all of the things that they had received from this world that they couldn't let go, and they could not accept Jesus. They had to get rid of him because Jesus was preaching a message of sacrifice. Jesus was preaching a message of selflessness. And it threatened to destroy all of the power that they had built up over generations. It threatened to destroy all of that. And so the Sanhedrin represent the people who are too proud to humble themselves. And for us, they are a warning. A warning that sometimes too many blessings can be dangerous. That sometimes Satan will use good things to try and get in the way of our salvation. That he will give us good things so that we forget how much we need Christ. because we feel like we have what we need, that we don't need to depend on Christ, that we don't need to sacrifice because the world is good to us. And so the Sanhedrin are an example to us to not be too proud, but to be willing to humble ourselves because they were too proud to listen to Jesus. The governor of Rome, Pilate, he represents someone who was too caught up in this world to listen to Jesus' message. In one of the other gospel accounts, I believe in the Gospel of John, it describes a conversation that takes place between Jesus and Pilate. And Pilate reveals to Jesus that because of the position he is in, because he is the governor, because of the pressure that the authorities are putting on him, that his hands are tied, that there's nothing he can do. Because the power of Rome, the duty to the government that he has, was more important than the innocence of Christ. And he was too caught up in this world, too caught up in his position and his authority, too caught up in trying to run a country to listen to Jesus. And he is a warning for us too. Because you may have heard this before. If the devil can't make you sin, he'll make you busy. If the devil can't make you sin, he'll make you busy. He'll make you too busy to devote yourself to God's will. That's what he'll do. And that's what was going on for Pilate. He was too busy with his duties to his country to stop and listen to Christ. He knew what was going on. He was aware. And so I pray for Pilate, because even though he knew, he was too busy to stop and to listen to the truth of Jesus' message. And he is a warning for us. And the last is the prisoner, Barabbas. But Barabbas is not a warning like the other. Barabbas represents the redeemed. He represents us. You see, Barabbas was the first person saved by the death of Christ. He was the first person saved by the death of Christ, because death was waiting for Barabbas. He was going to die soon. But Jesus took the place of Barabbas. He was put up there as the worst possible option, the chief of sinners, the worst of the worst. And Jesus took his place. It doesn't say much more about the life of Barabbas. We can only wonder what he must have thought, what he must have felt. But it probably wasn't unlike what you felt and thought when you were saved by Christ, realizing that you were dead, but that because of what Christ did, you now have a life. And so Barabbas represented the coming redemption of all humanity, the kind of people that Christ was dying for. It was people like this prisoner, Barabbas. And as we talk about redemption, as we talk about the Easter story, the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the fact that Jesus was silent. Why did he choose to be silent in this moment? We know the power of his words. It was evident to everyone. It had been transforming lives. Hundreds and thousands of people left their families and their lives to go and follow him, to go and see the things that he was doing, to listen to his words. That's how powerful and impactful his words are. And we know that if Jesus had only opened his mouth, he could have proved his innocence. He could have stopped all of this. So why would he remain silent? Well, he gave us a clue when he spoke the one thing that he said to the high priest when he spoke about the coming glory. And the reason that Jesus was silent was because, like he said, there is going to be a day. There's going to be a day when that glory will be revealed. And when you will see the Son of Man sitting in the seat of power at the right hand of God, and there will be no denying. And every knee will bow, and every tongue will confess. And in that day, we will be the ones who are silent, because there is nothing we can say. But in that day, Jesus will speak up for us on our behalf. And so, I want to offer you an opportunity to be embraced with love, to be embraced with the same sort of selfless love that Jesus was willing to show, even the worst of the worst. And if you need that love, if you need the life that Jesus died to give all of us, then I invite you to come forward today as we stand and sing together.